Yes, okay. Okay, now you're recording. Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. I will share my slides because I love PowerPoint. And okay, now, okay. Can you see the slides?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'm like the invited or guest actor of this talk. So my mission here is just to offer a brief overview of the taxonomy, and especially about the conceptual hierarchy of the taxonomy and the nature of both samples, of the two samples we use it to develop and validate our taxonomy of anti-vaccination arguments. After my brief 10-minute presentation, Luke will talk about the model he developed, the very cool model he developed, and I'm actually very interested on what Luke has to say. So I will be, I mean, that motivates me to be even faster. Okay, so we developed this taxonomy as a one of the deliverables of the first or the second work package of our project on vaccine hesitancy, Jitsuvax. And the main idea was to organize this plethora and chaotic large amount of arguments opposed to vaccinations, which have raised a lot of interest during the last years, in particular during the last two, but have been, I mean, a very lively domain during the last 2 or 3 decades, probably. So we used layered, with 3 layers concept hierarchy. The basic level is the argument. We defined an argument using the very basic and classic definition, like 2 or more speech acts, not necessarily sentences, but speech acts could be pictures or expressions, gestures, supporting a reason, well, offering supporting reasons for a given conclusion. Okay, so an argument is not a rhetorical device in that sense that an argument is a chain of reasons to argue that a conclusion is true or false. Okay, a rhetorical device instead, for example, irony, sarcasm, is different because there's no logical relationship between saying something with irony and the true value of the conclusion. Okay. I have to say that we were not interested, well, I will talk about this later, but we're not interested in the raw data. We're not interested in the direct arguments of people. But at least at the beginning, we're interested on the arguments that were reported in the academic literature. So we were not interested in tweets or Facebook posts, but on what the scholars have gathered and conceptualized, okay, as an anti-vaccination argument. The second layer is a theme. We defined the theme as it is normally defined in thematic analysis as a pattern of shared meaning that give rise to clusters of related arguments. So, for example, there are many conspiracy theories around microchips or Bill Gates, and we clustered those arguments into a theme. Okay, for example, the theme Bill Gates or microchips. Okay, and then the attitude root. The attitude root is basically the psychological predisposition that lead people to selectively search for and adopt arguments to oppose vaccination. Okay, this is, I mean, it's not new. It's basically a psychological construct that drives an attitude or give rise to an attitude. Okay, so for example, the attitude roots of the arguments or the theme about Bill Gates would be conspiracist ideation, right? Which is the classical psychological construct underlying conspiracy theories. Okay, this attitude roots, I mean, the concept was raised by Matthew Hornsey in, well, in a seminal paper a few years ago. So this will be the basic structure. The arguments are the basic level. They cluster into themes, and themes cluster into attitude roots. Okay, or attitude roots branch into themes, and themes branch into arguments. Okay, so we started the taxonomy conducting like expert review to select the main predictors or attitude roots described as linked to hesitant attitudes. Okay, so we had a lot of discussions and exchanges a lot of ideas and studies on predictors. Well, some of them were experimental, some others were correlational. So, and we selected 11. Some of them are classics, like greatest hits of matching hesitancy, conspiracy ideation, religious concerns, distrust, moral concerns. But we also found some new ones or some novel concepts like epistemic relativism, or this distorted risk perception, reactance, selfishness. Okay, the process was more or less iterative. We first developed a selection. We went to the data, and then we went back to the attitude rules to modify them and improve them, and then back to the data. And to validate this basic selection of attitude roots, we first conducted a systematic review of scholarly literature. Our idea, or our main goal, was to have a very large data set of contrarian arguments to conduct thematic analysis and expose the thematic structure of each of these roots. For this, we used this search string, and we searched the main academic databases, including preprints. This is the Prisma workflow. Well, I think, well, we adapted the search string to each of these search logics or systems. Well, that was an interesting process. Okay, the sample we got was composed of 152 scientific articles, including quantitative, qualitative, historical, and philosophical analysis. And we then extracted all the arguments from these 152 articles. Okay, this was a very arduous task. And we extracted 2,066 arguments. Some of them are repeated, and some of them are very unique, only present in one region or one country. We used 2 levels of specificity, more or less a specific level with very clear content. For example, it is poisonous and impure. The immune system of a child is too fragile. Okay, and there was a more abstract level, like a more abstract conceptualization. For example, natural is best, fragile immune system. Okay, for example, in this case, this article reported many arguments which we classified as warranted beliefs. And we also consider the possibility of arguments with two attitude roots, one dominant and one secondary. In this case, for example, this fragile immune system was considered an unwarranted belief and also fear and phobias, with the dominant in this case being unwarranted beliefs, okay? We also calculated word clouds based on the frequency of the words within each of these attitude roots. For example, this one is for worldview and politics, and this one is for moral concern. As you may see, it's about abortion, sexual activity of young girls in relation to the HPV vaccine. The one on moral worldview and politics is about civil liberties, for example, populism, elites. We also conducted qualitative thematic analysis over this sample, identifying 62 themes. For example, in the root epistemic relativism, we found 5 themes. Truth is relative, anecdotal evidence, epistemic superiority, individualistic epistemology, all or nothing. And we also prepared a brief explanation of each of these themes. In the case of conspiracy ideation, we also find 5: government cover-up, big pharma. Well, Dawn discussed this one the last meeting, and this is particularly difficult. Population control, made-up threat, targeting the disadvantaged. Here you can find, a wide range of different political positions, worldviews, but they are all linked to the same attitude roots. For example, you can find epistemic relativism or conspiracy ideation linked to the far right, to the far left, but they all share, in our view, the same psychological predispositions, right? In a second study, I will finish with this slide, we conducted topic modeling. Our goal in this case was to try to validate our taxonomy using a different kind of sample. In this case, we used fact checks of a specific case. In this case was the COVID-19 vaccine. So for doing that, we thought that it would be very nice to try to automatize the process and develop a computational model and compare the accuracy of that computational model with the human coding of our roots. Okay. For this, we extracted the fact checks from a very comprehensive website, and we extracted 595 fact checks. More specifically, we extracted the full text of the debunk, the full text debunking the contrarian argument, and also the headline summarizing its content. And using this search terms, VAC and VAX, okay? This is important because the human coders use only the title, while the computational model used the whole text, and we compared the accuracy of both codings. Okay, and I think this is all I have to say. Now Luke will talk us about this computational model, right?
Thanks, Angelo, and over to Luke.
So it is my hope that you are seeing my screen. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, so whoops. So yeah, my name is Luke Bates, and I'm a first-year PhD student at the Ubiquitous Knowledge Processing Lab at the Technical University of Darmstadt. And I met with Professor Lewandowski in the fall of last year, and he gave me this data that Angelo just described, and I'm going to talk to you about the work that I did on this data. I first like to try to do a bit of an acknowledgement. So I'm part of the TeDCog project, which is a project where we try to use artificial intelligence to help people lead healthier lives. And in particular, what I'm working on is using natural language processing to combat conspiracy theories in social media. This project is run by my advisor, Professor Rena Gurevich, who's also the head of UKP. And then my co-conspirator, if you'll ignore the stupid joke, is Max Klockner, who is another, I think he's third-year PhD or second-year PhD student. So before I get into what I did, I'll kind of give a very high-level explanation of natural language processing and text classification, because I treated this problem as a text classification problem. So what we do in natural language processing is we try to train machine learning algorithms that can tell me what category does a piece of text belong to. And the most classic example would be spam email identification. So you give emails to your classifier says, your machine learning algorithm says, okay, that's spam, that's not spam. And then that's basically the process. So how do you go about doing that? Well, what you do is you create a data set of text of different emails, and then each email has a label associated with it. And then you do something, and you feed that information to a machine learning algorithm. The algorithm hopefully learns the trend of the data. And then you take a new example, you show it to the machine learning algorithm, and hopefully the algorithm will output something that is correct. Hopefully it outputs, if it's a non-spam email, this is not spam. If it is a spam email, this is spam, right? And so a large part of the ongoing quest in natural language processing is this feature extraction part, where feature, you can understand feature to mean the independent variable. So I need machine learning algorithms like vectors, machine learning algorithms like numbers. They don't like text. So we need in natural language processing to take text and convert it to a vector. And that there's many different ways to do that, and I'll talk about some of them today, but that's the general pipeline of what happens. What's different about this data set, and here I'm going to be talking about the two data sets that Angelo mentioned and two different versions of them. So in this case, I'm talking about the specific level. So my understanding of the specific level is the Antivaxxer said something, and then the cognitive scientist or the psychologist kind of summarized it in a succinct way. And then there's a label associated with this kind of summary. And then I'll also be talking about the fact-checked articles that Angelo mentioned. And there's also an attitude root associated with these articles. But then each article and each data point, well, each data set, I should say, each has a different version where they have the full 11 label version and then also the collapsed version, because some of these attitude roots have logical overlap. So we can shrink them down to less labels, less attitude roots. So what's really interesting about this data set is, well, first of all, it's multi-class. So when I say multi-class, what I mean is there's 11 different labels. There's 11 different attitude roots. It's not binary. It's not spam, not spam. It's distrust, conspiracy ideation, epistemic relativism. Right? And then there's also multi-label, which Angelo also mentioned. And multi-label, what that means is that a piece of text could have multiple labels associated with it. It could have multiple attitude roots. It's not just one. And in natural language processing, that's not very common. Most data sets are somewhat arbitrarily and somewhat artificially single label, I would say. So that makes it very interesting. Unfortunately, it's quite small. So 1,000, but there's about, in this specific level, there's about 1,000 data points. So it's not that many by natural language processing standards, but it's very realistic. So that's totally unique and natural that it would be a small data set, because these contrived data sets that you see in natural language processing quite often are kind of artificially large, I would say. What's also cool about this data set is that it's pulled from heterogeneous sources. So unfortunately, machine learning algorithms tend to learn the domain. And when I say domain, what I mean is, where did the text come from? Was it Twitter? Was it Reddit? Was it articles or whatever? Machine learning algorithms will learn the domain, and data sets are usually only pulled from one domain. So these algorithms that are trained on these data sets don't generalize that well to new domains. So a data set that has multiple domains in it is interesting, and it could potentially result in a more robust algorithm. And so this specific level text is very short. Like here I'm using the word token. Token just means word. It's just natural language processing talk for word. So the average length is very small. This is not a very long sentence, or this text is not very long, maybe a paragraph at most, and then sometimes it's as small as one token. So that's a little bit, that's not necessarily a problem, but that is something to keep in mind. Now, when I'm given a data set, the first thing I do is I try to look at the frequency distribution of the labels. And so here, when I say label, what I mean are the attitude roots. So here are all the labels in all their glory. And what immediately pops out to me, and hopefully pops out to you, is that these labels are very imbalanced. So this is what we call an imbalanced label distribution. So distrust, unwarranted beliefs, fear, and phobias, this makes up basically 60% of the data. And here's just a not so pretty picture about that, the kind of just a graph about what the label distribution would look like. So this will create a problem because machine learning algorithms tend to hedge their bets, and they don't really look at stuff that's infrequent. If it hasn't seen it a lot, it's just going to ignore it. So that could create a problem for us later on. And then here's just some information about how much of the data was going back to the multi-level thing or multi-label thing. You know, most of the vast majority of the data is single label, but there are, you know, a significant number of data points that are double label or triple label, and then quadruple label that's not very often at all. That doesn't happen very often at all. And so, like I mentioned earlier, some of these attitude roots share some logical overlap, so we can collapse them down into less labels. So this goes from the 11 label situation down to the 1 label situation. And here, what we've combined here is fear and phobias, distorted risk perception of disease, this kind of selfishness and reactance that can be combined into one thing. Conspiracy ideation and distrust can be combined, and so can religiosity and morality concern, right? So when Professor Lewandowski first told me, oh, well, we collapsed the labels, I was like, hooray, hopefully now the data set imbalance, the label imbalance will be solved. But unfortunately, that's not at all the case. So that we still have these 3 labels that make up the overwhelming majority of the data set. Now, I'm not insulting the data set in any way. This is a very naturally collected data set, so it's totally expected and completely natural that this data set would not be balanced. But I'm just mentioning that. So now, oh, by the way, I didn't mention this earlier, but if you have a question or a comment, or if I say something that's totally incomprehensible, please feel free to interrupt me and just say something, because I'm happy to answer. I'm more than happy for this to be a discussion, not just me talking. So anyway, now moving on to the articles from the study 2, these kind of fake news articles that were fact-checked. This is also again a multi-class, multi-label situation. The data set is much smaller in terms of data points. However, this is a very, very different domain because these are articles, right? So we can have very, very long, multiple paragraphs, multiple pages, huge articles here, and then some of them are quite short as well. So what we see is this distribution is very, very wide, not very tight at all, and there's lots of variance here. If we take a look at the kind of frequency distribution, we again see the same problem and it's interesting that it's the same labels as well. The same labels as well. It's distrust or unwarranted beliefs and fear and phobias make up the vast majority of the data set. And very sadly, epistemic relativism is not at all featured in this data set. So here is again just the same kind of picture, just to give you an idea of what the label distribution looks like. And then we can again collapse this down based on the attitude roots that have logical overlap. And we again see that unfortunately by collapsing this does not at all fix the problem of an imbalanced data set. Okay, and then here's just a plot about that. Right? So based on just kind of looking at pictures and looking at frequency distributions, this really seems like a very challenging problem to deal with from a natural language processing machine learning point of view, especially not even considering the fact that you need lots of psychologists, cognitive scientists, background expert knowledge in order to make this diagnosis. Right? So the research question I asked was, well, can we use like very simple machine learning models informed by natural language processing in order to kind of do this identification automatically? So now I'm going to take a step back real quick and briefly talk about classification metrics, and I will ignore this, but in machine learning, there are tons of different classification metrics, and by all means, you don't need to understand any of this, but I want to explain kind of two concepts here. So the most kind of intuitive classification metric would be accuracy. So accuracy is where in the numerator you have the number of correct guesses, and in the denominator you have the number of total guesses. So if I have 100 data points and I'm correct 95 times, I divide 95 by 100 and I get 95%, right? So that's good. Problem with accuracy is that we don't use it when we have an imbalanced data set. And that's because if we go back to the spam classification example, if I have a data set where my data set is 100 data points and 95 of them are non-spam, and then 5 of them are spam, I don't even have to write an algorithm. I can just return a function, just have a function that returns non-spam, and I'm right 95% of the time. So that's a bad metric when we're dealing with imbalanced data sets. So what we use instead is what's called the F1. And again, to really understand this, you have to listen to like lectures about classification metrics. But just as kind of a high-level summary, the F1 is a very commonly used metric when your data set has an imbalanced label distribution. And then there's many different versions of the F1, but I'll be talking about 2 different versions today. So the F1 micro and the F1 macro. And the intuitive way to understand this is that if the F1 micro is much larger than the F1 macro, then our algorithm is kind of doing majority class overfitting. It's just kind of only predicting examples that or labels that it's seen quite often and kind of ignoring the more infrequent labels. So I've mentioned overfitting a little bit. So I want to give kind of some idea about overfitting and the problem that it poses. So let's say, for example, in this picture that these blue dots represent non-spam and the red dots represent spam emails, right? What we like in machine learning is this black curve where our algorithm has created a decision boundary that captures the general trend of the data and is able to properly place data points in and outside of this black curve. It's not perfect, it doesn't get every data point perfectly, but it does capture the overall idea, the general trend that we see in the data. And that's just kind of a well-fit model. We don't like this green curve, and we call this overfitting, where the algorithm has just memorized data points and has kind of twisted in on itself in order to fit every single example and not really capture the general trend that you see in the data. And we don't like it because we think that this green curve will not generalize well to new data points. If I introduce a new data point, I think that the black curve would do a much better job at fitting this new data point than this green curve would. And the problem with like deep models or big models like neural networks or transformers is that they tend to overfit because the function they're computing is extremely complex. Yes, I believe there's a question.
So the metrics that you're using is for classifications.
That's correct.
You say that it's a multi-class problem.
Yep.
But these are for binary classifications.
Right, but so that's true. So, but you can do it in a binary sense, whether the algorithm is right or is right or wrong. So these metrics can be used in non-binary situations as well, and also in multi-class problems as well.
So for one of those 7 labels, you just got the right prediction versus the wrong prediction.
Exactly.
Okay.
Any other comments or questions? No, cool. Okay, so yeah, that's the kind of the high-level summary of machine learning and natural language processing. So now I'm going to introduce a table, and I'm going to explain this table. And if after my explanation of this table you don't understand this table, please ask me, because this is kind of the star of the show for the rest of what I'm going to talk about. So what we have is in the title of the table, this is the kind of the study that I'm talking about. So in this case, this is the specific level, kind of the specific level where the cognitive scientist has summarized the argument. And this is the full label setting. So this is all 11 attitude roots. And then here in this kind of subtitle, this is the natural language processing algorithm that I've used in order to convert text into a vector. So TF-IDF stands for term frequency inverse document frequency. And this is a very old, but very powerful, very efficient, very clever way to take text and convert it to a vector. An important point is that this is a fixed representation. So after I compute the vector, I can't change it. Once it cannot be optimized in any way. And then in this left column, this is the machine learning algorithm that I'll be using. So I imagine that some of you are familiar with some of these. So for example, like I know logistic regression has many different applications outside of machine learning. So then here on the middle column, we have the F1 micro, which I mentioned, and then the F1 macro, which I mentioned earlier as well. This final row is just kind of the mean performance of all of these different classifiers. And then so you'll notice that this says mean F1 micro and mean F1 macro. And the reason that I did that is because in machine learning, we like to have kind of 3 different data sets, where I have the training data set, which is what I optimize my model on. I have the development data set, which is what I like to tweak little configurations of my model on. And then I have the test data set, which is how I evaluate my final model. Now, I didn't really have that in this case. So what I did instead was cross-validation. So I split the data 80%, 20%. I trained on 80%. I evaluated on 20%. And I did this 5 different times with 5 different splits of the data. And I did this over 5 different seeds. Many machine learning algorithms are dependent on randomness. By setting the seed, you make the randomness deterministic, and we do this for reproducibility. And you can do this, I do this 5 different times to get an idea of how robust the model is and how well it would perform in a more realistic situation. So again, these are the many different models that I used. And what we see is that performance is not that great. The performance is kind of all over the board. And we are still in kind of majority class overfitting. And this is only for the first study, only when we're talking about this study on a specific label. And this is the 11 label situation. So if we collapse, yes, please.
Just a short question about the algorithms. Although I understand that they're maybe it's not so particular about the ones you use, you just want to get an idea of how they're doing. So yeah, these are all off the shelf and not tuned, I guess, or was just wondering whether you penalize logistic regression and decision tree, whether that's card or what kind of stuff you were using there.
So here, this is just default hyperparameter settings. So it's just off the shelf import. First thing, just see just kind of get a better idea of how difficult the learning problem is. Okay, cool. So again, this second table is the same table again, but now we're in the collapse labels, the collapse situation where instead of 11 labels, we have 7 labels. We see that the collapse situation has kind of simplified the learning problem, and the algorithms are doing much better, but still, this is still not that great, right? Still not as good as we would hope that it would be. So now this second table is, or this third table, I should say, is now with study 2. And unsurprisingly, study 2 is a much more difficult learning problem because the text is much, much longer. The algorithm has to keep track of much more information. It's much more varied, I would say, in terms of style. And it's much harder for the algorithm to fit here in order to assign a route to these different pieces of text. And then this is again the full label situation, 11 labels, and the collapsed label situation. So these first results say what this says to me, that this is a very challenging learning problem, especially in the context of and especially in the context of these fake news articles. So what we see is we have a lot of majority class overfitting. The simple class of we have good training performance, but we have bad cross-validation performance, so we're overfitting. And we see that decision tree, these different algorithms perform best compared to the other algorithms, which is expected in a imbalanced data set situation. So now TF-IDF is great, but maybe we could do something a little bit more clever and something that has a much deeper and more richer language representation in the form of sentence transformer embeddings. Embedding is just another way to say vector. So it's just a word vector. I'm taking sentences and converting it to a vector, right? So what I did is I used what's kind of colloquially known as Burt, and I used this to create a vector representation of the text, and then I fit the same classifiers on top of this vector representation. What's important here, again, which I will mention, is the fact that once I've computed this embedding, this is a fixed representation. It does not change. I cannot optimize this representation after I've fixed it. Or after I've computed it, I should say. So again, this is the study 1, the specific label, this kind of full label setting. And what we see is that classifier performance greatly improves. So this greatly improves classifier performance in both the F1 micro and F1 macro situation. And we're doing much better here. So that's good. So that's encouraging. Again, this is the study 1 situation. So this is kind of the easy situation here. And if we collapse the setting down to the 7 label situation, we see again a big jump up in performance overall. So then the next question is, well, what about fake news performance? So the SBERT, or the sentence transformer representation, seems to be better. How does it do in the fake news, kind of more realistic text, or kind of text that you would see in the wild? How does it do here? And again, the sentence transformer, the improvement is not as outstanding as it was above, but it is still a significant improvement, especially in the F1 macro situation. We see more than 10% increase here. So that's good. And then if we collapse we go the collapse situation, we see again a much bigger jump. Interestingly, the support vector machine, the TF-IDF support vector machine, actually was doing better than the sentence transformer one, but overall sentence transformers kind of are much easier for the models, or a much easier representation for the models to learn from. So as I mentioned, this sentence transformer embedding is created using transformer models, and transformer models are the state of the art in machine learning right now. But like I said, this representation is fixed. So what if what if we utilize these transformer models and we actually update this representation? Now we run the risk of overfitting, but maybe this representation that we can now optimize would be very helpful in improving performance on in this learning situation, right? So here's a very intimidating looking picture of what a transformer does. So transformers, a neural network at its heart is matrix multiplication, just a lot of it. And that's basically, there's a lot of fancy matrix multiplication going on here, and that's really all it does. So, but transform models are massive, and they are parameter beasts. So the transformer model that I learned, or that I use in this case, is probably the most famous transformer model, which is known as Burt. I imagine some of you have heard of Burt. But anyway, what we do is we input text. Burt creates a very nice representation, and then you put a classifier on top of this representation, usually a feed-forward neural network. And then the classifier will output some prediction, right? But what's different about this in the sentence transformer is that I can then tell Burt how he's wrong, and then Burt will update the representation to better fit the problem that it's looking at right now. And so now you'll notice here that I'm not talking about study 1, and I'll get back to that in a minute. So this is kind of a baseline, kind of something that I want to beat. So what I'm going to do is just kind of do standard fine tuning with different transformer models. So here's distill Burt based on case number Berta. These are kind of the most common transformer models that most people use. And this is an optimizable or end-to-end representation. So I can update or optimize the representation that Burt creates. And what we see is not very encouraging, right? We have this huge gap between F1 micro and F1 macro, and we are definitely overfitting. But that's also, not, like I said, it's very expected that these deep models would overfit, and it's not at all surprising that they would overfit as well. And if we collapse the setting, this of course improves performance, but it's still not great. We still have this huge gap between the micro and the macro. So, unsurprisingly, these transform models overfit. But then I thought, what if instead of looking at these different studies in isolation, what if we tried to combine them? So my question was, could I take this kind of expert summary, the specific level argument, teach it to the model as a primer, and then try to ask the model to predict based on that? So here, this is results again on the fake news articles, but these classifiers were first trained to predict on the study 1 text, the text of the cognitive scientist kind of summary. And then I did what's called zero-shot classification. What that means is I didn't optimize this representation at all for the fake news articles. I just asked it to predict. I just said, okay, you've looked at the specific arguments, now predict these texts. Do you see any characteristics that you saw from the specific arguments? Do you also see that in these fake news articles? And what we see is, again, not great results. So that I'm not going to say this is amazing results. These are not amazing results, but this is far better than random, and it's much better than kind of typical natural language inference off-the-shelf baselines, which were just guessing labels at random. So just typical standard natural language inference models that you could use were just guessing labels at random, and there seems to be a signal that's created in the specific level argument that primes the model to be able to account for or be able to identify this anti-vaxxer or attitude root. So this is again in the full label setting, and then here again are the results in the collapsed label setting. So I was encouraged by this. I thought, okay, well, what if we then just do a kind of 2 pre-training steps, or kind of pre-train and then train. So what that means is what I'm going to first do is do what I did in the Zeroshot classification situation, where I will train the model to recognize attitude roots on the specific level argument, and then I will continue to fine-tune the model representation and see if it can do better in the fake news article setting, and see if basically can I transfer this expert knowledge? Can I take this expert knowledge that the model learned in the specific level argument situation, transfer it or leverage it to be better at flagging text in a more kind of realistic social media situation? And that's basically exactly what we observed. So I can first, I fine-tune first on the specific level argument, and then I continue to fine-tune on the data from study 2. So this is an end-to-end optimizable representation. And we see in the full label setting, we have the best performance that we've ever gotten for this these fake news articles. And then if we collapse the setting, then we get quite good, I would say pretty decent performance here as well in this situation. So what this says to me is that we can transfer this expert knowledge to the model, and it can learn what are the characteristics of these attitude roots, and then be able to take that knowledge and look at it in a more kind of in the wild situation. So that's basically about all I wanted to say. So it's not at all surprising that just these natural language inference or these models that come off the shelf, that they don't generalize well to this very specific, very new, very novel problem, because this is new, not just, of course, to natural language processing, but I think also to psychology in general. But if we kind of think about what we're doing and we leverage this expert knowledge, then we can transfer this knowledge to the model, and the model can learn, and we can leverage this expert knowledge to improve performance in a text classification situation. There's a lot of different things we could do to try to boost performance, like downsampling, upsampling, hyperparameter tuning. But I was just, again, trying to showcase this data set and use very reproducible, very standard natural language processing approaches to model this data set. But I think that this is cool, and that we could, for example, create a tool where either for the annotator or the psychologist in question, they could input a piece of text, and then the algorithm could output a prediction, and the annotator or whoever could say, okay, that's correct, good job, model. And then we can feed that example back into the model, and the model can continue to learn from this. Or if the model's wrong, then the annotator can say, no, that's wrong, bad model, here is the correct label. And then we can feed this input back into the model again and continue to update this model. So yeah, that's about all I have to say. And I'm looking forward to anything that you might have to say.
Thank you, Luke. Great stuff.
Very much.
Yeah, really, very impressive. Yeah, over to whoever got there.
You can miss applause.
Who is the nuclear missile? Oh, Thomas.
Sorry, everybody. Yeah, it's Thomas. Hi. No, that's really interesting. That's really interesting. So I wanted to ask. I don't know that much about this data set. Can everybody hear me?
Yes,
we can. Yeah.
Okay, great. I don't know that much about this data set. But so these attitude roots, those have been assigned by people, and that's what you're trying to predict with your models. If I got that right?
That's correct. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. And then for these attitude roots, are they all categorical, like 0 or 1, or since people are doing it, are there confidence levels, or maybe there's sometimes one document has assigned multiple things, and so is your model? Are you taking any of that information into account in your model? And if, well, might that help out if you did?
Well, so I didn't have a kind of confidence information from the annotators itself, but it is, as I mentioned, it is multi-label. So the model does consider, the fact that a piece of text could be multiple labels at once. Kind of an interesting note, I didn't talk about this data set here, but actually Professor Lewandowski gave me another data set earlier, which was much more challenging to model. And what I noticed is when you compute the logits for this model prediction, because for a long time I thought there was a bug in my code and it wasn't working because it wasn't predicting anything. But this data, so because this is such a novel task, there's not a lot of stuff to inform the model about, and I noticed that the logits were extremely low. So the model showed extremely low confidence in its predictions with its earlier data set. And I also observed that here as well, that it took a long time to get these models to actually train and to actually start learning something. I'm not sure if I answered your question. So
yeah, I'm just wondering how accurate the attitude roots are. And maybe you could imagine there could easily be other categories that the original coders didn't include. I don't know exactly where those attitude roots came from. Angelo kind of, I think he did a good job describing it, but I wasn't quite sure where those came from, and whether or not the algorithm itself might be able to detect more or fewer dimensions. Obviously, you don't have a lot of data, so I wouldn't expect it to do that well. But I guess random. If the algorithm is completely guessing, and it's got about 10 of these attitude roots, and it can have multiple combinations of them, then I guess the actual a random algorithm would do much more poorly, like what, 2-3% or something like that.
Yeah,
So you're doing really well. Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, well, I have to say that we classify it. Yeah, this is theory driven, and we have to trust ourselves as coders of attitude roots, because that's we're assessing the accuracy of the model based on our previous classification of the same arguments. And yes, of course, well, we use it like the standard procedure of 2 coders with a third one acting as a referee. We calculated the Krippendorf alphas and so on. But yes, of course, that could be improved further, probably in the future, to try to produce a better starting point for the model, and also, of course, providing more input, more samples, tweets, Facebook posts, because here we are starting with this academic literature, then the journalistic literature, and yeah, I mean the kind of language we have here, we have academic language, in between academic and informal language is the language of news. Yeah, probably, but you're right. Yes, that could be an obstacle.
Well, can I just add one brief comment that we're presently planning an experiment. We're about to launch the experiment where we're trying to find independent confirmation for the roots by giving all these arguments to people for persuasiveness ratings and various other questions. And we then want to see if the arguments cluster within the roots that we have assigned, and whether within each of these roots, the expected personality predictors will kick in to selectively appeal to those arguments, but not others. So we're trying to get independent confirmation of that too.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
Thomas is absolutely right. I mean, it's a subjective exercise, and yeah, we're training the model on something that's not independently ascertained as yet. It is our judgment.
And in some sense, you get a little bit of confirmation from the model, from the algorithm, the algorithmic attempt to code it, right? The fact that it can do so well suggests that these dimensions are in there. Now, obviously, it might be using things that humans don't use. It could be using some other nonsense stuff to get it.
Yeah, absolutely. Because, yeah, I mean, the fact, and also that even the Zeroshot transfer was doing way above chance, I think means that we're picking up something with this taxonomy that is real, you know, especially given how different the two studies, the material is in the two studies. That was, yeah, there it is. I mean, I think that's pretty, that Zeroshot performance is pretty impressive there.
Yeah.
Given how low chance is. Yeah.
Agreed. Thanks.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Two short questions. The first one, you talked about a Krippendorf alpha. What did you get?
Quite good ones. Yeah, at the beginning we had a lot of disagreements about two, specifically in worldview and politics. Probably Philip can help me with this question, because Philip was my partner when classifying the attitude roots. And one was worldview and politics, and the other one was, I can't remember now, probably moral concerns or something. Yeah, but then in the second study, we improved them a lot. And our alphas now are quite good, I think.
So what does quite good mean? 0.4, 0.5, 0.7?
0.7, 0.8.
Okay, that's.
I mean, they are not outstanding, but it's, well.
And the second question, did you try any kind of data augmentation, like, I don't know, using synonyms, translating back and forth to get more data points?
So no, I did not do any data augmentation. That was something that Stefan and Ezekiel and I spoke about a little bit. But like I said, I was just trying to make this, I didn't want to, I'm not sure where exactly this will go, but I didn't want to get in the way of the taxonomy with the NLP. I didn't want the NLP to get in the way of the taxonomy. So I wanted to do something as reproducible and easy to create as possible, but we could also experiment with data augmentation or novel data point generation, pseudo labeling. We could do a lot of different stuff. So yeah.
Cool. Yeah, just wanted to let you know it was super useful for me to hear your talk, because we are doing a very similar thing right now. It's just about counter speech strategies, and we have the exact same situation that we have hand labeled data a bit more than you, and we are unsure about our labeling scheme. Yeah, taking the exact same approach. So we should probably keep comparing notes.
Sure, yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm glad. Well, first of all, I'm glad it was helpful. But yeah, data. I mean, so dealing with data imbalance is the one of the many pains of machine learning. So,
so yeah, the way we envisaged we would go, we are not doing it yet. Is so we're iteratively labeling the data that we have from a very large corpus. We have like 8 million examples, and we aim to label 10,000. And my idea is to like train the model as the data comes in, and use it to make predictions to oversample minority classes that we then pass to the labelers to kind of get around this, or at least alleviate the imbalance a bit. I've seen this in another project about suicidal tweets, and there it worked quite well. So I hope it works in our case too.
Sure, I wish you luck with that. Yeah, so there's a couple articles that, if I remember, I could send you or something about label suggestion, where the model suggests labels, and then you do that to ease the annotation task.
Exactly. Yeah, if you could send those along, would be great.
Sure, there's a couple from UKP actually, so I'll send those.
Simon, did you have your hand up, or was that a?
I did, but my question's been answered now. So.
Okay, good. Are there any other questions in the last 2 minutes that we have?
I think I need like another clarification of the difference between the zero-shot classification and the later stage.
Sure.
Because he said that this is feeding forward the expert's knowledge, and I'm not sure I understand, because in both cases you have the labeled data according to experts, don't you?
Yes. So what I mean is that when I say the expert knowledge, what I mean is that this is kind of the cognitive scientist summary of what an anti-vaxxer has said. So that's what I pre-train on first to do the zero-shot classification.
Because study one is looking at the scientific literature and their description of the argument
so it's
for us to then categorize
that.
Yeah,
so it's the corpus, it's not the architecture. Something. It's the. I understand. Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Okay. Well, then I want to thank everybody. We're about to be out of time. Thanks both Angelo and Luke. That was great. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you all very much.
And we're now pivoting to the second part of this for whoever wants to stick around. We have fortnightly additional meetings on professional development to discuss issues that are generally of interest, perhaps, to people in the field. Today, we're going to talk about reviewing, peer review, and various other aspects of that. you're all welcome to stick around. What I would do though, Almox, to turn off the recording, I think.